1940, the U.S. Navy was focused on grand fleet actions that had defined naval strategy for decades. They initially regarded the escalating German U-boat threat in 1940 with detached skepticism. The priority remained the construction of massive battleships. They also focused on high-speed fleet destroyers, like the sleek, powerful Fletcher and Summer classes. These vessels were capable of 36 knots. They were armed with 5 or 6 5-inch guns and were laden with torpedoes. Naval Command considered these ships the true arbiters of sea power. The concept of a smaller, specialized escort vessel was met with deep reluctance. This vessel was the Destroyer Escort, or DE. Many within the Naval Command viewed it as a second-class destroyer. Its construction was placed low on the list of national naval needs. Yet the Atlantic was rapidly turning into a graveyard for Allied ships. The German wolf packs were proving terrifyingly effective against merchant convoys. By 1941, the British were desperate, fighting for their very survival. Their critical Lend-Lease requests demanded anti-submarine vessels. The United States simply did not possess these ships in sufficient numbers. This external existential crisis forced the U.S. Navy to confront a harsh reality. The war would not be won by battleships alone. Victory required overwhelming the enemy with sheer numbers of escort ships. The resulting destroyer escort design was a product of urgent necessity and wartime compromise. Initial goals called for a ship of 1,200 tons. It would be about 300 feet long and capable of a reasonable 25 knots. But the industrial capacity of the United States was already severely strained. There were critical shortages of high-pressure reduction gearing and powerful diesel engines. They also lacked the preferred 5-inch 38 caliber main gun. These shortages dictated the entire program's direction. Engineers were forced to adopt diverse and sometimes suboptimal propulsion systems. The resulting DE classes were defined by the equipment they could acquire. The Everts class, for instance, used the slower but readily available diesel-electric drive. This class managed only 21 knots. The Buckley class utilized turbine-electric drive, reaching 24 knots. The later John C. Butler class finally achieved the 24-knot speed using geared turbines. Armament was also scaled down significantly. They typically featured 2 3-inch 50 caliber guns, which was enough to sink a surfaced submarine. This armament was supported by the relatively new Hedgehog launcher and the venerable, terrifying depth charge. Before the first of these specialized escorts could even be launched, the fight against the U-boats was brutal. It was a close-quarters affair relying on primitive technology. The primary weapon of the early Atlantic War was the depth charge. This explosive-filled drum was universally nicknamed the ash can. The terrifying ritual of an ash can attack was one of the earliest and most desperate acts of anti-submarine warfare. A ship would detect a U-boat, often fleetingly, and steam directly over the presumed location. The K-guns would fire the charges off the sides of the ship. Racks would release them off the stern. Then came the agonizing wait for the crew. They could only listen, their ears pressed to the sonar headphones, praying for a hit. When the charge detonated, the resulting concussion was violent and visceral. It shook the small escort vessel from stem to stern. One sailor recalled that it felt like the ship had run aground on concrete. The sound was deafening, a massive thump that rattled their teeth. Then the men held their breath, listening for any sign of debris. They needed any sign that they had not just wasted 1,000 pounds of explosives. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 instantly shattered all lingering reluctance within the U.S. Navy. The priority shifted overnight. Instead of building the perfect warship, they now needed to build any warship, and fast. The Destroyer Escort program, suddenly essential, became a model for American industrial mobilization. The scope of this effort was staggering. Over 1,000 destroyer escorts were eventually ordered. To meet this unprecedented demand, the shipbuilding industry had to expand dramatically. New private shipyards were quickly established for this purpose. They transformed coastal marshland into industrial complexes capable of mass production. Bethlehem Steel's new facility at Hingham, Massachusetts became a vital artery of production. So did Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company's new yard at Port Newark. Contracts were spread across the nation. This brought companies like Brown Shipbuilding, Consolidated Steel, and Drabo Corporation into the naval effort. While the first 50 destroyer escorts were built in Navy yards, the vast majority were not. The subsequent 955 ordered were assigned to these newly activated private yards. This underscored a massive shift in strategic thinking. By March 1942, the building priority for destroyer escorts was second only to major warships. The reluctant second-class destroyer had become the indispensable backbone of the Allied effort. The race was now on to get these essential, if imperfect, vessels into the fight. They had to arrive before the U-boats could choke off the Allied lifeline entirely. The crisis point arrived in the bleak winter of 1943. Despite the massive industrial push, the destroyer escorts were not reaching the Atlantic fast enough. The U-boats were operating with ruthless efficiency, and they were winning the war. In March 1943, the German Wolfpacks sank an appalling 110 merchant ships. This ripped the heart out of Allied supply chains. It brought Britain to the brink of starvation. The scale of these losses was existential. It confirmed that the Allies were, at that moment, losing the Battle of the Atlantic. The tide could only be turned through a combination of sheer numerical force and technological superiority. The destroyer escorts, once dismissed as slow and weakly armed, became the indispensable instrument of salvation. Crucially, they were now being fitted with a revolutionary anti-submarine weapon. This weapon fundamentally changed the geometry of the hunt. It was called the Hedgehog mortar. The old depth charge required a ship to steam directly over the U-boat's position before dropping its explosives. This forced the escort to lose contact with the submarine on sonar just as it attacked. The Hedgehog solved this paralyzing tactical flaw. Mounted forward, it fired a pattern of 24 contact-fused projectiles over the bow. This allowed the destroyer escort to maintain continuous sonar tracking of the submerged target. If the Hedgehog struck, the explosion was localized and immediate. If it missed, the crew knew they could immediately circle back and try again. This process avoided the violent, disruptive concussion of the old ash can. As the industrial floodgates opened, these better-equipped escorts poured into the North Atlantic. The coordinated Allied efforts began to shatter the Wolfpacks. The strategic turning point was swift and decisive. In May 1943, the U-boat war was broken. 42 German submarines were sunk that single month. Allied merchant ship losses plummeted to 45. The sheer, overwhelming presence of escorts and new anti-submarine technology had made the North Atlantic simply too deadly for the U-boats. Admiral Karl Donitz recognized the devastating cost. He temporarily withdrew his submarines from North Atlantic convoy attacks. This critical moment marked the irreversible loss of the campaign for Germany. The destroyer escort, initially conceived as a purely defensive screen, rapidly evolved into an aggressive hunter. By late 1943 and early 1944, the U.S. Navy formalized the creation of hunter-killer task groups. These groups were centered around a small escort carrier and several destroyer escorts. They were not tethered to a slow merchant convoy. Their sole purpose was to actively seek out and destroy submarines wherever they lurked. These missions bred a new kind of aggressive naval warfare. They demanded improvisation and extraordinary bravery from the often green crews. One particularly tense and cinematic engagement occurred in May 1944. It involved the turbine-electric Buckley-class DE-51 and the U-66. The German submarine was commanded by Oberleutnant Gerhard Seehausen. After a relentless depth-charge attack, the battered U-66 surfaced directly alongside the Buckley. In the dark, desperate chaos, the U-boat's crew attempted the unthinkable. They tried to board the American destroyer Escort. The battle became a shocking close-quarters slugfest right on the decks of the Buckley. Sailors scrambled for anything that could serve as a weapon. They grabbed coffee mugs, empty shell casings, and even used their fists. Meanwhile, the DE's anti-aircraft guns fired point-blank into the U-boat's conning tower. The German commander, seeing his opportunity vanish, ordered the scuttling. The surviving German crew, some of whom had briefly stood on the Buckley's deck, plunged back into the dark water. The U-boat sank quickly beneath the waves. The engagement was a raw demonstration of the desperate and unforgiving nature of the Atlantic War. It proved the unflinching resolve of the destroyer escort crews. The culmination of the hunter-killer strategy came just weeks later. On June 4, 1940, the audacious capture of the U-515 occurred. A hunter-killer group centered around the carrier USS Block Island cornered the U-boat off the coast of West Africa. The Buckley, now under Lieutenant Commander Brent Abel, played a central role in the pursuit. His ship forced the submarine to surface. What followed was unprecedented in naval history. Instead of sinking the vessel, Abel's team executed an aggressive tactic designed to seize the prize. Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David led the boarding party. They jumped onto the still-moving, flooding U-boat. The men raced against time in the incoming sea. They secured vital intelligence, including the German Enigma code books and the machine itself. They had to retrieve the materials before the submarine could sink entirely. One boarding member recalled the terrifying descent into the dark, narrow hull. He said the air inside was thick with diesel and stale sweat. He knew if the boat went under, they would be trapped. The captain had given them a clear order. He told them to get the codebooks, no matter what the cost. The capture of U-505 was not just a tactical victory. It was an intelligence coup of staggering magnitude. The seizure provided the Allies with invaluable insight into German naval communications. However, it also created a significant dilemma for the Navy's high command. They feared using the intelligence might compromise the secrecy of the code-breaking efforts. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, around 175 U.S. Navy destroyer escorts were operating in European waters. These vessels, once considered second class, were credited with sinking 28 U-boats. They formed the unbreakable shield that guaranteed the flow of men and material across the Atlantic. Only 6 destroyer escorts were lost due to all causes in the European theater. This low number was a testament to their sturdiness and the effectiveness of their crews. The rapid industrial mobilization that produced these ships secured the essential victory. The tenacity of the young sailors who manned them made all subsequent Allied offensives possible. The vast, blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean demanded a fundamental redefinition of the destroyer escort's purpose. It was often a brutal redefinition. The destroyer escorts of the Atlantic had been the tireless shepherds of slow merchant convoys. Their counterparts transferred west were thrust into the grand, violent theater of fleet warfare. By July 1943, only 21 destroyer escorts had reached the Pacific. That number swelled rapidly, growing to over 50 ships. This growth coincided with the beginning of the great island-hopping campaigns from the Philippines to Iwo Jima and Okinawa. In the Pacific, Japanese naval doctrine prioritized the destruction of enemy warships over merchant vessels. This priority rendered the destroyer escort's original anti-convoy role secondary. Instead, they were integrated directly into massive amphibious assault forces. They acted as the indispensable, though often overlooked, screen for troop transports and logistical ships. They also protected the precious and vulnerable escort carriers. They became the thin, fast layer of protection surrounding the slow, essential core of the invasion fleets. This new role was fraught with unanticipated peril. It culminated in one of the most desperate and improbable naval engagements of the entire war. This was the Battle off Samar on October 25, 1944. In the dim, chaotic light of dawn, the 6 small escort carriers of Taffy 3 were steaming off the coast of the Philippines. They suddenly found themselves facing the full might of the Japanese Central Force. This force was commanded by Admiral Kurita. It included 4 battleships, among them the colossal Yamato. The Yamato mounted 18.1-inch guns. The force also included numerous heavy cruisers and destroyers. Taffy 3's screen comprised just 7 small warships. These included 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. These 7 ships were armed primarily with 5-inch guns and torpedoes. They were all that stood between the overwhelming enemy fleet and the defenseless carriers. The orders given to the small ships were simple, impossible, and absolutely necessary. They were told to charge the enemy line. The destroyer escorts, including the USS John C. Butler, USS Raymond, USS Dennis, and the legendary USS Samuel B. Roberts, immediately went into action. They laid down thick, choking smoke screens to shield the carriers. Then, in a courageous, almost suicidal act, they raced toward the Japanese line. The Samuel B. Roberts, a John C. Butler-class destroyer escort, became the embodiment of this desperate courage. She was armed only with 2 5-inch 38 guns and a handful of torpedoes. She charged the heavy cruiser Chokai and launched her last remaining torpedoes. She scored a devastating hit before being obliterated by overwhelming fire. One sailor from the Roberts recalled closing within yards of the massive enemy ships. He described firing their small guns into the Japanese superstructure. He said they were fighting like a battleship, though they were just a damn tin can. The John C. Butler, amidst the chaos of torpedo wakes and exploding shells, participated fully in this vital screen. Its crew maintained an astonishing composure. They dodged fire intended for ships 10 times their size. This fierce, outnumbered assault by the 7 small warships was a tactical shock to the Japanese command. It confused Admiral Kurita. He was led to believe he was facing a much larger fleet. The enemy broke off the engagement, saving the escort carriers. This action arguably saved the entire Leyte Gulf operation. The battle off Samar cemented the destroyer escort's reputation. It proved these second-class vessels were capable of extraordinary feats of combat effectiveness and bravery against the heaviest armor afloat. Yet the greatest threat to the destroyer escorts was not the battleship. It was the airplane. The introduction of the kamikaze suicide aircraft in October 1940 fundamentally changed the calculus of war in the Pacific. The destroyer escorts acted as the outermost screen for the fleet. They suddenly became the first and most frequent targets. Allied commanders faced a limited supply of high-speed fleet destroyers. They often viewed the slower, more numerous destroyer escorts as expendable screening assets against this terrifying new aerial weapon. This grim assessment meant that the DE crews found themselves manning the front lines of aerial combat. Their small ships, optimized for anti-submarine work, now functioned as desperate anti-aircraft platforms. The toll was heavy in the ensuing fighting. Over 25 destroyer escorts were struck by kamikazes at Okinawa alone. The Shelton was sunk by a torpedo, and the Ebersol followed shortly after. This highlighted the escalating vulnerability of these ships. They faced the Japanese willingness to sacrifice pilots and planes for a single hit. The ultimate test of survival came for ships assigned to radar picket duty. These were isolated stations where the destroyer escorts were deployed far from the protection of the main fleet. Their job was to provide early warning of incoming raids. It was here, north of Ieshima on May 20, 1945, that the USS John C. Butler, DE 337-9, faced its single-handed duel. Captain John Pace and his crew were steaming alone. The radar picked up a horrifying sight. 10 Japanese kamikazes were incoming. They were a mix of Zeros and Hayabusas, flying fast and low. There was no time for reinforcements, and there was no escape. The Butler was entirely on its own. The DE's 2 5-inch 38 caliber guns roared to life. These guns were originally designed for surface combat. They fired shells fused to explode in the air. This created lethal flak barriers above the ship. The Bofors and Oerlikon anti-aircraft batteries hammered away relentlessly. They filled the sky with bright tracers. the crew worked the guns with frantic, practiced efficiency. The first two kamikazes dove, but they were destroyed before they could enter their final attack run. A third plane was engulfed in flames. It spiraled down into the sea. Still, the overwhelming swarm kept coming. One plane, already burning and shedding pieces, managed to get dangerously close. It exploded just before impact. Another plane aimed squarely at the superstructure. It was nailed by a desperate burst of fire. The plane disintegrated just short of the hull. The sheer force of the explosion smashed the ship's radar installation. It was torn clean off its mast. Debris rained down heavily on the decks. There was shrapnel and burning fuel everywhere. Horrifyingly, bits of the pilot's clothing mixed with the spray of seawater. This showered the terrified but resolute gun crews. The Butler, a 1,350-ton ship built for convoy escort, had just fought a sustained close-range action. It fought 10 suicide attackers and survived with only minor damage. Captain Pace was later awarded the Silver Star for the engagement. This was a high honor that underscored the extraordinary bravery and capability of the DE crew. The John C. Butler's survival, like the impossible charge at Samar, debunked an ocean. It eliminated any lingering thought that the destroyer escorts were merely second class. Their sturdiness and adaptability were unmatched. Above all, the unflinching courage of their largely inexperienced crews made them indispensable. These ships were the versatile workhorses of the fleet. They could hunt U-boats in the freezing Atlantic one day. The next day, they might fight off a desperate suicide attack in the tropical Pacific. The relentless shipbuilding engine of the United States did not stop on VJ Day. Instead, it simply reversed course. The urgency that had ordered over 1,000 destroyer escorts now faced the cold, hard logic of peace. The U-boat threat was neutralized and the Japanese fleet was destroyed. The Navy suddenly found itself with a massive, immediate surplus of ships. Over 344 destroyer escort orders were canceled outright. Still, more than 500 hulls remained afloat. They were sturdy, well endowed with endurance, and suddenly without a clear mission. The admirals faced a strategic dilemma. Should they scrap the lot and invest in the next generation of warships? Or should they find innovative ways to utilize the immense existing inventory? The latter course prevailed. This decision was driven by economics. It also met the immediate need to fill critical gaps in naval strength, left bare by the war's demands. The inherent adaptability of the DE hull made it an ideal candidate for repurposing. It had been designed for stability in the harsh North Atlantic. Already during the war, some had been converted into mobile power generators. Ships like the USS John and Whitehurst steamed into devastated ports. They went to places like Manila and Guam. Their mission was to provide essential electricity and water. This conversion was a silent testament to the versatility of the original design. Other crews recognized the need for fast transport in the Pacific. These ships had been transformed into fast attack transports, or APDs. Workers stripped out the anti-submarine gear. They replaced it with specialized equipment to carry landing craft and troops. But the most significant conversion was driven by a new, looming enemy. That enemy was the Soviet Union. As the Cold War began to crystallize in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the threat changed. It was no longer an invisible U-boat. It was the potential for long-range Soviet bomber fleets carrying nuclear weapons. The defense of North America required an early warning system far out at sea. This protective perimeter consisted of radar pickets. They needed to spot the enemy hours before they reached the mainland. This necessity gave birth to the Destroyer Escort Radar, or DER. The Navy began redirecting DEs into this new role. They chose the diesel-powered classes, such as the Edsall and Butler. Diesel propulsion was slower, but it offered greater fuel efficiency. It also required lower maintenance. This made them ideal for the long, lonely sentinel duty required of a radar picket. The conversion was extensive and thorough. The ships were often stripped of much of their existing armament. They might retain perhaps two 5-inch or 3-inch guns. Crucially, they were fitted with massive tripod masts. These masts accommodated the powerful rotating SP radar arrays. These humble ships became the frontline watchmen of the American defense posture. They were assigned to the wet, distant early warning line. This was a crucial chain of floating sentinels. The line stretched across the wide ocean approaches. From 1955 to 1965, the DERs endured patrol after patrol. They were often thousands of miles from land. Their existence was defined by the low hum of the diesel engines. It was also defined by the constant hypnotic sweep of the radar screen. This duty was a profound psychological test. It was a war of pathological boredom. This monotony was punctuated by high-stakes tension. Tension rose whenever an unidentified contact appeared on the scope. The crews were often composed of young men who had missed the fighting of World War II. They maintained a silent, cold vigilance against a threat. That threat never materialized, but it shaped every moment of their service. The sheer, overwhelming number of these converted destroyer escorts created a profound consequence. It had a lasting effect on the U.S. Navy's strategic development. The DEs were cheap, plentiful, and functionally adapted to immediate post-war needs. The Navy had hundreds of serviceable hulls. These ships could function as APDs, DERs, and trainers. Therefore, there was no immediate political or economic incentive to invest. They did not design and build new, faster, purpose-built replacements. For over a decade, the Destroyer Escort acted as a massive bureaucratic roadblock to modernization. This was entirely inadvertent. The ships were born of wartime necessity. They clogged the fleet and delayed construction. They held back more appropriate, high-speed anti-submarine vessels needed for the jet age. Ultimately, the inherent design limitations of the Ds could not be overcome. Their 21 to 24 knot speed was sufficient to catch a slow-moving U-boat of 1943. However, that speed was useless against the advent of the true high-speed submarine. The nuclear-powered subs arrived in the late 1950s. The new submarines were faster submerged than the destroyer escorts were on the surface. This rendered the World War II-era hulls obsolete for their original anti-submarine mission. The final chapter for most of these converted vessels was the scrapyard. Others were transferred to Allied nations throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Yet, the legacy of the Destroyer Escort remained one of remarkable tenacity. They were born of compromise and dismissed as second class. They were thrown into the most desperate battles of the war. The Destroyer Escort program proved that improvisation and adaptability could yield crucial strategic value. This value lasted long after the initial crisis had passed. The ships that saved the Atlantic and charged the Yamato were the very same ships that kept watch over the Cold War skies. They demonstrated that the ultimate measure of a warship is not its size or speed. It is instead the persistence of its purpose and the courage of its crew. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel. Liking this video helps us preserve these important stories. Please share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.